The Juvenile Imbecile Olavo de Carvalho, Jornal de Tarde, April 3, 1998. I have believed many lies, but there is one I have always been immune to, the one that celebrates youth as a time of rebellion, independence, and love of freedom. I didn't fall for that nonsense even when I was young myself, despite it flattering me. Quite the contrary, from an early age, I was deeply struck by the herd mentality, the fear of isolation, the subservience to popular opinion, the craving to feel equal and accepted by the cynical and authoritarian majority, and the readiness to surrender everything, to prostitute everything in exchange for a spot as a novice in the group of cool people. It is true that young people often rebel against their parents and teachers, but that is because they know deep down that these figures are on their side and will never fully retaliate against their attacks. The fight against parents is a little play, a game with marked cards in which one contender fights to win and the other fights to help them win. The situation is very different when the young person faces their peers, who do not have the same paternal leniency toward them. Far from protecting them, this noisy and cynical crowd greets the newcomer with contempt and hostility, showing them right away the need to obey in order to avoid being crushed. It is from their peers that they get their first experience of confronting power, without the buffer of an age difference that offers room for leniency. It is the kingdom of the strongest, the most brazen, asserting themselves with all their cruelty over the newcomer's fragility, imposing trials and demands before accepting them as a member of the horde. How many rites, how many protocols, how many humiliations must the applicant endure to escape the terrifying prospect of rejection and isolation? To avoid being sent back, powerless and humiliated into their mother's arms, they must pass a test that demands not so much courage as flexibility, the ability to conform to the whims of the majority. In short, the suppression of personality. It is true that they submit to this with pleasure, with the desperate passion of someone who will do anything for a condescending smile. After all, the group of peers represents the world, the big world into which the adolescent, emerging from the small domestic world, seeks entry, and entry is costly. The candidate must immediately learn a whole vocabulary of words, gestures, glances, a whole code of passwords and symbols. The smallest mistake exposes them to ridicule, and the rules of the game are usually implicit, needing to be guessed before being understood, imitated before being guessed. The method of learning is always imitation, literal, servile, and unquestioning. Entering the juvenile world sets in motion the engine of all human folly at full speed. The mimetic desire that René Girard speaks of, where the object attracts not because of its intrinsic qualities, but because it is simultaneously desired by another, whom Girard calls the mediator. It is no surprise that the initiation rite into the group, demanding such a high psychological investment, eventually drives the young person to complete exasperation, while also preventing them from turning their resentment back onto the group itself, the object of their love that eludes them and thus has the power to transform every impulse of rancor into a new investment of love. So where will this rancor be directed if not in the safest direction? The family emerges as the providential scapegoat for all the young person's failures during their rite of passage. If they fail to be accepted into the group, the last thing that will occur to them is to blame their situation on the vanity and cynicism of those who reject them. In a cruel inversion, the blame for their humiliations is not placed on those who refuse to accept them as an adult, but on those who accept them as a child. The family which gave them everything will pay for the cruelties of the horde that demands everything. This is what adolescent rebellion boils down to: love for the stronger person who despises them, and contempt for the weaker one who loves them. All transformations occur in the shadows, in the indistinct zone between being and not being. The young person, in transition between what they no longer are and what they are not yet, is, by fate, unaware of themselves, their situation, and the authors and causes of what is happening inside and around them. Their judgments are almost always the complete inversion of reality. This is why youth, ever since the cowardice of adults gave it the authority to command and dominate, has always been at the forefront of all the errors and perversions of the century. Nazism, fascism, communism, pseudo-religious sects, drug consumption. It is always the youth who are one step ahead in the direction of the worst. A world that entrusts its future to the youth is an old and tired world that no longer has any future at all.